So now we're going to just, before we go to the next witness, we're going to file some documents, which is going to be a weekly event.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mather. I'm one of the Commission Counsel. As the Commissioner indicated, we are now going to enter into evidence a number of documents, and this is something that we expect that Commission Counsel will do every week. To provide some context to the public, the Commission has received more than 60,000 documents as part of its investigative process. Commission Counsel have identified and continue to identify documents that are relevant to the Commission's mandate. Many of these documents will be entered into evidence, as you've already seen, through the examination of witnesses. They may also be entered into evidence through reports that are filed by the Commission or by institutions that have an interest in the Commission's proceedings. Given the Commission's timelines, however, we are not able to introduce all the relevant and material documents in these manners. And some of these documents then will just be entered through this process. These are documents such as affidavits the Commission has received, meeting minutes, situational reports, other standard records and correspondence. On a weekly basis, Commission Counsel advise the parties about the documents that they intend to admit into evidence the next week. These are documents that the Commissioner may refer to or rely on in his final report, and for this reason, the parties are given an opportunity to object to the admission of any of the documents before they are admitted. Today, we are entering the first batch of these documents. There are 447 documents in total. They include, by way of example, city bylaws for the City of Ottawa, City Council motions, minutes of the City of Ottawa and the Ottawa Police Services Board, and letters of request for assistance relating to the city. As noted, these are documents that the parties have had the opportunity to review and advise whether or not they have an objection, and we are admitting those documents over which there was no objection. These documents will be posted to the Commission's website in the coming days, and again, as I noted, this will become a regular part of these proceedings. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you. Now, next, we have a further witness, Ms. Rodriguez. And perhaps what we can do is start that evidence and maybe take a break in, say, about somewhere around 4 o'clock, if that's agreeable.
Yes, of course. For the record, Natalia Rodriguez, Senior Commission Counsel, and the Commission would like to call its next witness, Kim Ayotte.
Will you swear on a religious document, or do you wish to affirm?
I prefer to swear on a Bible, please.
Please take the Bible in your right hand. For the record, please state your full name and spell it out.
Kim Ayotte, A-Y-O-T-T-E. First name Kim, K-I-M.
Do you swear that the evidence to be given by you to this commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ayotte.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you again.
Very nice to see you. Thank you.
You had an interview with Commission Counsel on August 8, 2022. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And have you had a chance to review the interview summary that was generated from that interview?
Yes, I have.
And at this time, do you have any corrections to make to that summary?
I do not.
Okay, so we will now proceed to enter that into evidence. It's WTS 20. And I'm just going to pull it up. And this is your witness summary, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I want to cover a few short areas with you just to maybe clarify a few issues that have come up in the last few days. You were not originally intended to testify, and some issues have come up that we think you might be able to clarify for us. The first area is with respect to the issuance of permits. Can you confirm whether any permits were ever sought or issued for this protest?
I'm not aware of any permits being sought, and I know that none were issued.
Okay. Now, there was some suggestion, I believe, that that a permit was granted for some porta potties. Do you know anything about that?
There were no permits granted for porta potties for the City of Ottawa. I personally authorized the use of some porta potties at the early stages of the protest.
Okay, but that was not in response to a permit request, was it?
That's correct. It was not in response to a permit request.
Okay, and this was just your own incentive?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about bylaw and fire services, and your role as you're the general manager of the Emergency and Protective Services, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so bylaw services reports into you, is that right?
Yes, they do, through a director, Roger Chapman.
Right, and is that the same for fire services?
Yes, through the fire chief, Paul Hutt.
Okay. And so I want to understand a little bit more the relationship between bylaw and fire on the one hand, and fire services, and OPS over the course of these events. And these events, obviously, we're talking about the convoy protest in Ottawa in January and February of this year. I want to take you, just to refresh your memory and provide some context, to OTT 2120, so 2120. And the document is entitled Media Availability, January 31st, 2022. And you're the custodian of this document. It was brought to us by the City of Ottawa, was produced by the City of Ottawa, and you were listed as the custodian. Did you author this document?
I did not. This was authored by our Public Information and Media Relations Department. However, we do provide input into it, and this is a document that's prepared for me for media releases or for media events where I may get asked questions in certain areas, and these are the key messages and responses to some of those areas.
Okay, and you would have reviewed this document before any key messages were delivered to the public based on this, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And so if we look at the fifth bullet point, so there's a few questions there. Yes. So it says, what was bylaw's role this weekend? And by this weekend, it means the first weekend of the convoy, since this is dated January 31st. And it says, how did they support Ottawa Police and what kind of infractions were incurred? And then it says, bylaw and regulatory services role is to support the lead enforcement agency, Ottawa Police, to keep demonstrators peaceful by assisting with parking control and other issues as requested by the City of Ottawa.
Yes, demonstrations peaceful, yes.
Demonstrations, yes, thank you. So can you explain what bylaw's role was in that weekend, meaning did it have the role of enforcing as requested, or could it enforce on its own initiative?
So in Ottawa, we work under an incident management system, which is a document also recognized by the province of Ontario with regards to any type of incident or any type of event that we participate in. Through that system, we identify incident commanders or agencies that have jurisdiction and agencies that play support roles. And in this particular case, as it was a protest or demonstration, it fell under the authority, the sole authority, quite frankly, of the Ottawa Police Service, and we were playing a support role. So we would assist, or we would attend and do bylaw enforcement. However, we would always report to police with regards to what we were seeing and if there were any potential threats towards our officers with regards to, violence or anything of that nature. Then we would certainly back off and ask for police support to go in. So initially, that was the mode of operation. We would report to police and we would allow bylaw officers to issue tickets. Our primary purpose was to maintain the emergency routes on the first weekend to ensure that vehicles, emergency vehicles such as fire trucks and paramedic vehicles, et cetera, police vehicles, can actually make their way around the city, as all of those things were pre-planned prior to the demonstration to look at every risk in every building, to identify how we would respond should there be an incident at any one particular building.
Now, did you participate in the update that Chief Slowly gave, the briefing on January 26th with respect to what to expect when the convoy arrived? I believe the mayor was involved and Steve Kanalakis. Were you there as well?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And in that briefing or any time before or after, was it suggested to you that bylaw would not be issuing tickets and towing on that first weekend?
No, what happened is on the 29th, which I believe is Saturday, we received information through the EOC, through our Emergency Operations Center, that bylaw had encountered some difficulties in the field, and that now the police have established a red zone, and bylaw was to not issue tickets in that red zone unless it was approved or through the NCRCC, the National Capital Regional Command Center, and that bylaw was escorted into that zone, and that was on Saturday the 29th.
So prior to the 29th, was bylaw exercising its authority to issue tickets and to tow independently?
Yes, it was, with the understanding that any single point of contact could cause a potential serious incident or riot, and that was something we heard regularly from the police, so we were very cautious on that front, and we advised our officers to be very careful not to be that point of contact that could initiate a riot. And as a result of that, we were asking them to be very careful, and if they were fearful for their safety, that they should, back off and seek police support before issuing any infractions.
Okay, so on Friday the 27th, when they started to arrive, Saturday the 28th, bylaw was functioning as it would normally at any regular day, issuing tickets and enforcing as it normally would.
Sorry, Council, just for clarity, Saturday is the 29th. I just don't want the witness to be confused.
Oh, okay, thank you. Sorry, my apologies. I keep thinking that Saturday was the 20, okay, gotcha. Sorry, so Friday the 28th and Saturday the 29th. So up until that point on the Saturday, on the 28th, everything was bylaw was acting as it normally would, and on the 29th, something occurred for that to change.
Yes. What we mean by bylaw acting as it normally would, again, is a support function to the police. It's tantamount to if we have a major house fire, fire is in charge and their incident command, and then the police come up and they don't tell police what to do, but the police support the fire operation. Actually, a better example would be if there was a shooting and there was a victim inside of the house and our paramedic service was to respond. They wouldn't just run into the house after the victim without first clearing with police who are in charge of the incident because of the severity of it, clearing with them that it's safe for them to go in and do so and actually take care of the patient. So there are agencies that have jurisdiction based on the severity or the incident they're dealing with. And in this particular case, a protest was a police jurisdiction. So we would take, bylaw would not report to police, but they would certainly take their direction from police if required because the police were the agency having jurisdiction.
Okay, so that was decided at the outset that that's the way it was going to work prior to the arrival of the convoy, right?
That's how it always works for protests in the city of Ottawa.
Okay. And so on Saturday, you're saying that something changed on Saturday, is that right?
I received notification from the EOC through regular briefings, and we receive a lot of them, that yes, there was bylaw encountered some difficulties. I wasn't given all the specifics with regards to what had happened, but I was told that as a result of that, the stance has changed and that a red zone has been established, which is probably concurrent with the red zone that was established for traffic management, et cetera, and that bylaw should not go into the red zone unless a directed or approved, I can't remember the exact words used, but there is documentation on this and supported by protection of the Ottawa Police.
Okay, and when you say the red zone, what did you understand that zone to be?
So the red zone would fluctuate throughout the protest based on the amount of vehicles coming in. So originally the red zone was, primarily the downtown core, and then it expanded to include Rideau and Sussex because of the activity there. It also included Coventry eventually, and then it expanded up south of Wellington based on the vehicle locations. So again, where the protesters were generally where the red zone would expand and contract based on police activity. And so it was fluid, quite fluid.
And so what was Bylaw's role outside of the red zone?
Bylaw's role outside of the red zone was to continue to enforce city bylaws, recognizing that if they encountered any vehicles with protest paraphernalia or any type of suggestion that vehicles were involved in the protest, which happened in certain hotspots throughout the city, whether it was the Vanier Church or Bronson Avenue, that if it was related to the protest, it still required some sort of police either support or notification that you're going in and enforcing your laws.
And when you're saying that there was an integration then with NCRCC, does that mean that calls to bylaw to 311 were being redirected to NCRCC?
Yeah, it depends on the call, because some of them were, whether it was anti-masking, pandemic type calls, or whether it was, parking calls or noise was a big one, obviously, illegal fires, etc. So in the hot zone following the 29th, yes, those calls would go to Ottawa Police to triage and the NCRCC if they were to be acted on.
And so I just want to clarify in your witness statement, just to make sure I make sure that is, in line with what you're saying now. In your witness statement, and we can pull it up if that's helpful to you, but it says OPS directed the city on January 29 to instruct bylaw officers not to ticket or tow vehicles anywhere in the red zone without police approval. Is that essentially what you're saying about what happened on January 29th?
Yes, that's a paraphrasing of what I had been advised of through the EOC.
Okay, so this was told to you through the EOC. Beth
That's
Gooding
correct.
would have been the one to inform you of that?
That's correct.
Okay. And so that stance from January 29th about the red zone and that bylaw was not to ticket and tow without police approval, that didn't change throughout the protest, did it?
Well, in the enforcement stance changed, and I believe it was in approximately February 4th, where police wanted to take a more aggressive enforcement posture, and they established a special team where bylaw and police would work together and just go out and start ticketing in full force. And so that was called a quick response team, I believe is what it was called at the time.
Right, but the stance that bylaw could not ticket or tow without police approval, that was maintained throughout the entire protest.
In the red zone, yes.
In the red zone. And as you said, outside of the red zone, if there was some sort of indication that the vehicle in question was related to the protest, then the police would make the decision as to whether or not to ticket or tow. Is that right?
That's correct. And if I didn't say so earlier, it was primarily as a result of officer safety. Our officers are not trained to the level that police officers are not equipped with the same type of tools that police officers are equipped. They are trained to deal with conflict, but mostly verbal. So, I mean, we're very concerned about what we didn't know. Right? I was not informed of all of the intelligence that the police had with regards to the element of the crowd. And what I was basing a lot of my decisions on was based on what I was seeing south of the border when, buildings are burning and riots are happening and people are dying. And when we were preparing for a worst case scenario for this event, that's the image I was trying to, one, avoid, but to prepare for in the event that we got to that point.
Right. And Mr. Kanalakis testified yesterday that sometime in the second week, there was an integration between OPS and bylaw to ensure bylaw safety. Do you have a sense for when that was? Do you know?
In my head, I believe it was around February 4th where they established those quick response teams, and that's where they would work together.
And you're saying that was primarily for bylaw officer safety, correct?
It was for everybody's safety, right?
Yeah.
Our concern is not just for the bylaw officers. That's my primary concern because they're not my officers. They work with me. But I'm also concerned for the protesters' safety, for police officers' safety. There were a lot of people in the protests who weren't angry. but there were a lot of people in the protest who were angry. So, we have to protect everyone.
And when 311 calls were being redirected to NCRCC, was that within the entire municipality of Ottawa? How did that work exactly?
I can't speak to how the 311, triaged the call at that point in time. I know that bylaw would have worked with them directly to say, here are the, standard, questions you would ask. And based on the information you receive, it would either go to the police or it would go to bylaw.
And are you aware of any instances in which bylaw wanted to act and wanted to enforce some bylaw violation and they were prevented from doing so?
For most part, throughout the incident, not enforcing what they do for a living was a morale hit for bylaw officers. They were frustrated that in the media they were being criticized for not doing their job when in fact they were told not to do their job. For the senior leadership, we understood why that was there. We tried to relay that to our bylaw officers, but yeah, there was a morale issue and a want to go out and do their job. And they certainly proved that in the follow-up protests that came to town, whether it was Rolling Thunder or even on Canada Day. They enforced a lot of their activities then.
So if a vehicle did not appear to be related to the convoy, that vehicle could be ticketed or towed? There
had to be some discretion. So if it was in a no stopping zone, it was towed no matter what, even if it was related to the convoy, because we needed to keep the emergency routes open. And they did an excellent job keeping the emergency routes open. We did ask our officers to use some discretion because, the perception of us ticketing our citizens, of a vehicle and then not ticketing one because next door it's a convoy was just not proper and it wasn't appropriate. So we did ask them to use discretion and to be careful on when they ticketed citizens that were mixed up in with the convoys. It just looked like we were taking sides, and that's not appropriate, and that's not what we were trying to do.
Right. And quickly, it appears based on the evidence we've received so far that there were numerous fire code violations and other infractions that would involve fire services, such as open fires in barrels, stockpiles of fuel, illegal fireworks, etc. Not just in the red zone, but in residential areas as well. So I want to ask about how fire services, which is also under your direction, was able to exercise its function within this system that you've now described, where bylaw is essentially integrated with the police.
Exactly as bylaw did. It would go through the NCRCC. There was a fire representative in the NCRCC. In the event that there was a major incident that would occur, they were able to provide very quick situational awareness on what the incident is and how they were going to deal with it from a fire perspective. But with regards to enforcement of the fire code and open air burning, it was the exact same thing. We would either receive a complaint through 311 and we would advise the NCRCC, and they would say, we know we have a fire. They go, yeah, we know it is. We know there's a fire there. And the police would actually make the decision, do we go in or don't we go in? Some of it was based on their resources. Other it was based on the criminal element that was holding the fire. But for the most part, the fire took not their authority, but certainly direction from the police with regards to, and they did it on several occasions where they did go in and put out fires.
But that was with OPS support, correct?
Exactly, always with OPS support.
And so if fire services saw a potentially dangerous situation and wanted to act to remove that hazard, they had to have OPS support in order to do that. Is that right?
That's correct. And that was seen with regards to the removal of the flammable liquids at two of the sites where there was an accumulation, a quantity of flammable liquids.
Okay. And so fire services never acted on its own authority, like independently from the police?
Fire services would go out and do inspections on their own, whether it was undercover or whether they were, just to see what they can observe. They would report back through their chain of command, and they would get direction from the police on when can we go in and deal with this issue. Report the risk, and then let the police identify when the police had the resources to deal with the risk.
Okay, and we're going to take our afternoon break now, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll take 15 minutes and come back at 4:15. Thank you.
Recess for 15 minutes. La commission est levée pour 15 minutes. Order à l'ordre. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Welcome back, Mr. Ayotte.
Thank you.
If I can take you to OTT 9778. And before we do it, I have been asked if you can please slow down your answers a little bit. I am also guilty of this for the purposes of the translation, so I think we will both try to speak a little bit slower, if that's okay.
Agreed.
Great, thank you. Okay, and this is not the document I wanted. 9778, yeah, okay. Well, it may be that I have it wrong here in my notes, but in any event, if we can actually go down, this is, I did want to take you to this one for something else, so we can go to this document, that's fine. So this, my understanding, is a letter that you wrote to Mr. Paradis, who is the Director of Real Property Services at Public Services and Procurement Canada. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what was the purpose of this letter?
We were trying to get security around the cenotaph in that it had been desecrated. Several instances had occurred overnight, and we wanted it protected. And so I put the request in through the EOC to contact the federal government to see if they can provide security services and or a fence around it so that we can protect this very important site. At which time I received notice that, yes, they wanted it in writing, so I proceeded to put it in writing.
Okay, so you contacted them first, and they said, put the request in writing, and that's what this is that right?
That's correct.
And did they provide that fencing, and did they put that fencing up?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And did this request come from OPS, meaning did OPS ask you to reach out to procure this fencing, or was that something the city did on its own accord?
It came through me through the EOC, which has an OPS sergeant in the EOC. So I believe it came through the OPS in that they did not have the resources to secure and protect the site, and they were asking if the federal government could actually provide that security.
Okay, so OPS through the EOC was asking the city to ask PSPC to provide this fencing.
That's correct.
Okay. So we can take that down now. I wanted to ask you about towing and towing capacity. My understanding is that, and I had a document ready for that, but it's the wrong one. In any event, that there were about 28 vehicles that were towed that first weekend. Does that sound about right to you?
That sounds correct, yes.
Okay. And my understanding is that most of this towing was directed at ensuring that the emergency lanes were cleared. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And were any heavy trucks ever towed by the city?
No.
At any point?
No.
Okay. So any towing and any towing numbers refers to pickup trucks and passenger trucks, essentially, passenger vehicles. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, we see later on, and I think you'll agree with me, that minimal towing happened subsequent to that first weekend. There was sometimes there would be no days where, sorry, there'd be days where there'd be no towing, and there'd be days where there'd be one or two vehicles towed. Does that sound about right?
Correct.
And so we heard that towing companies were not willing to participate in towing for various reasons, and that was the reason why towing wasn't more aggressively pursued. Is that right?
Well, there are two issues there. One is towing of small vehicles. We are still accomplishing that, but we had to work within the red zone, and the emergency routes were staying clear. So I think the protesters got the message early on that we were going to have zero tolerance in the emergency routes for the protection of the citizens and themselves and the buildings of the City of Ottawa. But the secondly is the larger vehicle towing was the real challenge for obtaining those tow services. And so we reached out, the EOC again reached out looking for resources. We were getting it from all different directions. The police asked the EOC to see if they can make some contacts. The police were also making contact with various tow companies. They were asking if we had any contact with the province. So through the EOC, again, we were contacting the province to see if they had resources. The mayor suggested that, Mayor Tory in Toronto had contacts. We did receive those from the mayor. And again, we would inquire with regards to the availability of towing. And for the most part, it was no. They didn't want to participate, and initially they were sympathizers for the most part. The other thing was that it was their client group, and you know, their reputational risk down the road with regards to losing those clients. I didn't hear damage to trucks much, but then they came out and said it was a driver safety issue, and that's what they kept bringing forward all the time, following you know, other discussions with them. Any leads we had or any possibilities of towed were passed down to the EOC, the work was being done by the EOC to make these contacts. They were provided to the police, and police ultimately made the contacts and got the appropriate tows to end the protest.
But the towing that was being procured or was being looked at was heavy towing capacity, is that right?
That's correct.
And so in terms of the other towing capacity for passenger vehicles, the city had that, right?
Yes, we had those contracts. They were still willing to do the smaller vehicles. There were delays in obtaining tows at times, and that caused some issues. But for the most part, we were able to tow if we needed to tow smaller vehicles.
Right, and passenger vehicles or smaller vehicles include pickup trucks, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the reason there were 28 tows in the first weekend and very minimal towing after that, there was no other day where there were double-digit towing. It was 1, 2, sometimes 0 vehicles being towed, and there is a chart that will be entered into evidence that shows the number of vehicles that were being towed every day. Is that because the towing companies that had been towing that first weekend refused to continue towing, or is it because bylaw was not requesting additional towing of passenger vehicles after that first weekend?
It's not the first thing you mentioned. It wasn't because we couldn't get the tow trucks. It was primarily because the emergency routes were being maintained and they were open. And that's what we normally find with a major event is the first few hours you get a lot of people who aren't familiar with the closure of the emergency lanes or keeping the no tow zones. And then, you know, they get towed. And then the word gets out quite quickly that those are no tow zones or tow zones, sorry. And then, you know, things self-correct to a certain degree.
So the purpose of towing was exclusively to maintain emergency lanes, is that right?
That was our priority of towing, yes.
Okay, so if the emergency lanes were maintained, then no towing would take place generally?
That's correct.
Okay. So let me ask about emergency lanes then. I want to understand a little bit about how they worked. So the question is whether there was an emergency lane maintained on all streets, or whether certain designated routes were ensured that they had an emergency lane north, south, and east, west. Can you shed some light on that?
Yes, only certain routes had emergency lanes. Again, these were all pre-planned. So part of our planning cycle, and we do this for all events and demonstrations, is we have a city department, transportation department that actually has experts that look at traffic flows and you know, how to best manage the traffic and the incident. And it's called TIMG, the Traffic Incident Management Group. And they work closely with police to identify, you know, how are we going to manage the incident that's being proposed or coming forward. And they would close certain lanes. For example, Kent Street was closed completely. There was no emergency lane on Kent Street. And there were a few other streets like that. But for the most part, we had the emergency routes that we had identified through the TIMG group were maintained throughout the protests. Sorry.
So if an emergency occurred on Kent Street, a street that you've indicated was completely blocked off, so a building in the middle of Kent Street, there is a fire or some emergency, how would the emergency vehicles get to that street?
We were able to access it through other streets. So, you know, the streets that are running perpendicular or parallel to it, the buildings were accessible by other means.
Okay, so...
it's not an ideal situation, but it was the best situation that we could come up with based on the planning.
Okay, so, and I assume then that there would be some areas that would not be completely accessible. If a lot of streets were closed off completely, or there were several streets that were closed off, then there would be at least some buildings that would have been inaccessible to emergency vehicles.
every building was pre-planned in that they would, fire and paramedic service would look at their CAD and look at what they were dealing with in the preparation for all of this. And they do it for other city events such as Canada Day, et cetera. And they go, okay, so how are we going to get there if there's an incident? And what's the biggest risk incident that we have in this building? So let's say for fire, it would be a fire, a major fire. And then how would we access it? And we ensure that we have multiple access to every building. Even so one street could be closed, but you might still have 3 other streets that actually, encapsulate or surround that building. So those buildings were all, we were sure that we can attend all of those buildings. It wouldn't be an ideal response because sometimes you'd want to put your ladder truck, let's say, on Kent Street to actually bring the ladder or tower up to access certain floors, and that wouldn't be available. But there was always a plan to how do we actually assess and manage these types of situations when we're faced with them. So we were comfortable from an emergency service that we could access the buildings that we needed to access given any emergency.
Okay, and when you said the CAD, they would look at their own CAD, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so fire services has a computer-aided dispatch system. So it's a
Sorry, can you repeat that?
computer-aided dispatch system.
Yeah.
So it identifies, the streets, where the hydrants are, the buildings, the height of the buildings, what the risk is for the building. So, a hotel would have a much higher risk level than a government building that's unoccupied, or a government building that's not occupied in the evenings or on the weekends. So based on the risk level, will dictate how many resources we actually have going to those calls. So it's not always just one fire truck going to an incident. In fact, sometimes people will say, oh my God, that must have been a big fire. There was like 6 trucks going to it. Yeah, it might have been a false alarm. The reality is those 6 trucks were required in the event that it was a real incident. They needed to set up. There are so many different tasks that need to take place in the initial minutes to be successful that those resources need to be there.
Okay, and in this case, were there any delays from EMS or fire, ambulance to be able to access any points within the areas that were occupied with trucks?
There were no substantial delays. We did get some complaints with regards to paramedics not being able to access or a paramedic trying to get through a street and it was taking a little longer. But we investigated every one of those complaints to look at it with regards to our response standards to see whether or not they still fell within our response standards. And if they didn't, was it an acceptable risk? Was it reasonable? And we didn't have any high-level risks that we were concerned with regards to any response.
Okay. Now, I just want to ask about the relocation of the trucks as part of the negotiation between the protest group and the City of Ottawa. I want to take you to OTT 30057. Is this a text message from your phone?
Yes, it is.
And it says Chris Protester in brackets. Is that the name that you entered for that phone number?
That's correct.
Okay, and who's Chris Protester?
It's Chris Barber.
Okay, and so in green, this would be you speaking, and the gray would be Mr. Barber, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And if I can just take you to page 4 of those exchanges. So you say, are you continuing to try to move trucks today, or has that effort stalled? And if we just go up a little bit more, we'll see. I just want to look at the date that was sent. If we go up, so it's on Tuesday, February 15. Okay, thank you. We can go back down. Are you continuing to try to move trucks today, or has that effort stalled? And he says, we moved maybe 40 yesterday. I wore myself out yesterday with that, rested up now, and preparing to get at it again. And then you say, thanks, Chris. So we have heard that there were about 40 heavy trucks that were relocated as a result. Is that your understanding as well? Is that what Mr. Barber was telling you?
Yes, I concur with him that was my approximation as well at the time.
Okay, and there were an additional passenger vehicles that were towed as well?
Yes, because there were trucks and cars and pickup trucks, and to move the trucks, they had to move the smaller vehicles as well, and they were relocated. Not necessarily all on Wellington, but they were relocated.
Okay, so this 40 number refers to the heavy trucks only, right?
Correct.
Okay. And we know that shortly after this message, the effort to relocate trucks stopped or was ended. You also had discussions with Superintendent Drummond, who I understand was the OPS liaison to this relocation effort. Did he explain to you why there were no more trucks being relocated to Wellington at a certain point?
No, he simply indicated that the police were no longer allowing trucks on Wellington.
Okay, and he didn't give you an explanation for why?
No.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions for you, Mr. Ayotte. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Council. First up is the Ottawa Police Service.
Good morning, good afternoon, Mr. Ayotte. It'll soon be good evening. Thank you. I am David Michikowski. I'm counsel for the Ottawa Police Service. I just want to get some clarification with respect to the relationship between bylaw and regulatory services and the police. And you mentioned Roger Chapman, is that the name?
Yes, he's the Director of Bylaw Services, correct?
And so if you could please turn up OTT 0359. And if we scroll down to the bottom of the chain, there is a draft. Yeah, so if we just stop there, thank you very much, in which it indicates, or perhaps you could just go up a little bit more so we could just see, yeah, it's from Peggy Starrett to Ghislain Lamotte. And you'll see that what has been sent is I guess, a draft release to Ottawa business partners that has been drafted and is being sent to you ultimately for review, correct?
I believe I'm in the review process, yeah, further up into the exchange.
And so you'll see, if we look at the the sentence that begins, the OPS will always be available to respond to any issues of safety you may encounter by dialing 911. If you are experiencing issues relating to COVID-19 and masking, please call City Bylaw at 311 first. Correct?
I see that that's what they were suggesting.
And so if you then could scroll up to the next email, just this is the date of Thursday, the 27th, correct? So it's the day before the protesters started arriving. And so just above that, you'll see there's a response from a Michel Lalonde, I think, at 11:06 a.m. And so Mr. Lalonde says, bylaw has one area of concern. The OPS will be available to respond, so it's the same email, and he has highlighted the sentence that says, if you're experiencing issues relating to COVID-19 and masking, please call City Bylaw at 311, correct? And then you'll see underneath, he writes his comment about, I guess he has concerns about that phrase. And he says, since this relates to a protest demonstration, COVID-19 complaints are to be directed to OPS for response. Responding to COVID-19 complaints during a protest demonstration is a safety issue for our officers by being subject to violence. We have made our position clear over the year that bylaw services does not respond to protest demonstrations, including the activities surrounding it. Can we change what is highlighted in yellow? And then if we scroll up above that, you'll see there's a request for a revised text. And then if you scroll up to the, continue scrolling up, please. And then you'll see that somebody named Tanya McCumber has said on January 27th, below is the email chain regarding the calls within the demonstration. Roger advised myself that Kim made the police aware yesterday at a meeting, and Roger will reiterate again tomorrow at the meeting with the police. And I take it you did reiterate that position?
Yes, I reiterated the position that we would not be putting bylaw officers in dangerous situations that could affect their health or the safety of anyone around them.
And that had been, I guess, the consistent position of bylaw for about a year prior to that, it sounds like.
As I indicated earlier, yeah, it was the position for all protests and demonstrations. I want to say it's always been that way, but it's been that way for a long time, as far as I can remember it.
You mentioned that there were occasions where bylaw went in with police in these QR teams. These are quick response teams, correct?
Yes.
And so they would issue tickets for parking, noise bylaw complaints, and that would be in the demonstration zone, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, there were several hundred tickets issued by those quick response teams for those type of complaints, were there not?
Yes, that's correct.
We can also see, if you could be good enough, please, to turn to 10463 OTT. And if we could just look at the first page, those are your notes, Mr. Ayotte, is that correct?
Embarrassingly, yes.
They're pretty legible. So if I could
You
just
caught me on
ask,
a good day for these, because some of
If
my
I-
other notes are not that good.
I could just ask to look at number 3. Sorry, I wonder if we could just see the date of your notes.
February 2nd.
February 2nd. Okay, perfect. And number 3, the market was in the red zone, but that zone has been shrinking as a result of police demobilizing the demonstration. So you were able then to provide some enforcement in bylaw enforcement in that area as well.
That's correct. Kind of like what I was explaining earlier, the red zone would contract and expand based on how the protesters, they would expand on the weekend and contract during the week because of the amount of additional people that would come in on the weekends.
I understand that on the first weekend, so that would be the weekend of starting Friday, the 28th, 29th, 30th, there were, is it fair to say, thousands of trucks in Ottawa?
I think our estimation was, 500 to 1,000. Like it was difficult to tell because of all the small vehicles as well. If you included all of the small vehicles, yes, it would be over 1,000.
My understanding was after the weekend, after the first weekend, we've heard somewhere in the vicinity of 70% of those big trucks left. Is that consistent with your understanding?
The consistent number throughout the following weeks was around 400 to 500 that actually stayed behind, and those were big trucks. Those were the tractor trailers. That number would fluctuate as well, as it would expand and contract, but mostly it stayed consistent because the trucks moved into the area and stayed there. They chained themselves together. They made themselves difficult to move, and as a result of that, they were there for the long haul.
So that'd be about 400 or so, I think.
Correct, yeah.
And you'd agree with me, I assume you were following some of this on social media while it was going on?
I have people send me social media links. I'm not the social media guru that others are, but I was following some of it on social media.
And
yes.
you would agree with me that there was a lot of misinformation about what was going on, what the demonstrators were doing, what they might do?
I'm not sure that that I can corroborate whether the information I was seeing on social media was misinformation or accurate information. I did report to my office every day, which is City Hall. I was exposed to the honking every day. I did go out for a walk and observe certain things. So unless you can give me some specific information with regards to what the misinformation might be, I'm sorry. rather than
Fair,
speculate.
fair enough. We'll be hearing it from others.
Sure.
So, that's okay. We did not have in Ottawa 15,000 hotel rooms occupied by convoy members for 30-day periods, to your knowledge, did we?
I don't think we have 15,000 hotel rooms in the city of Ottawa, but yes, no, I don't think that they were all occupied for the entire duration. That's
Right.
correct.
Because basically the core was those 400 trucks, correct?
Yes.
I wonder if you'd be good enough, please, to look at document OTT 10103. And if we can start at the top, I guess. This is some iMessages, I assume, between yourself and Beth Gooding.
Correct?
And Beth Gooding is the Director of Public Safety. Have I got that right?
That's correct. And she was the incident commander of the EOC.
And this is on February 15th, so that's the Tuesday.
Correct?
And the movement of trucks, as I understand, pursuant to the mayor's agreement, was on February 14th. Is that right?
Correct. That's when it started, yes, to move the trucks.
And on the 15th, as I understood your evidence, the police had stopped assisting in the moving of trucks and were encouraging the truckers to go home. Is that right?
Yes.
And on the 15th, then, you were discussing what happened in that agreement, what the effect of it was, correct? With Ms. Gooding? And so
I was trying to obtain numbers of trucks that had moved.
Sure.
Because that was the key question that I was being asked from the city manager and the mayor's office.
And so if you'd be good enough, please, to look at Beth Gooding's message at 1:24 p.m.
Correct.
And so you'll see you're asking her about the number that are still there. And she says, I think there's about 337.
57.
357, but that Chief Slowly had been saying 400, so that there's a delta of 43, correct?
Yeah, so what I read from that is that the 400 was the original number, and now the police are saying there's 357, so what had moved is 43.
Right. And then we see at 1:26, you tell her that what you're interested in the numbers is the big trucks and whether they move. That's what you want the information.
That's correct.
And so you tell her at 1:56, if you could please scroll down. You tell her that according to the protesters, I think they moved about 40 the previous day. Is that right?
Yes.
And she said that that basically aligns with what the NCRCC has said, correct?
Correct.
And at you continue then to discuss how many and how it's difficult to count them. And if you could please look at 4:19 p.m. You have to scroll down a bit. So at 4:19, Ms. Gooding says, also confirming again that there was some weirdness yesterday. When trucks left spaces, other vehicles got into the empty places left as the hardcore protesters are jockeying for position.
That's what she says.
And the agreement, as I understand it, with the mayor was that the truckers said that if vehicles move, they would not be replaced, correct?
Correct.
And so that seems not to have occurred.
Yeah, my understanding is, as I indicated earlier, that while they were moving some of the big trucks, they had to move some of the smaller pickup trucks that were wedged in between them or beside them, and that those were probably the ones jockeying for spots after the fact.
And so if we then look at 457, that same chain, you indicate you're going to report approximately 175 trucks remain south of Wellington and 120 north of Wellington, correct?
Yeah, I believe that's after I actually walked it and counted them.
And if you could look at 425, please, if you just go up a bit. You're talking about, I guess Ms. Gooding is giving you the count as best as they're able to on the 15th of the number of trucks remaining, correct? At the various locations.
Yes.
And so what we see is Metcalf, 70 trucks, correct?
Yes, that's what she says.
And so yesterday we saw a picture from the mayor's office of Metcalf, and we saw no trucks on it, but I assume that we were only seeing a one-block portion because there were about 70 trucks still on Metcalf, it looks like. Is that what you're understanding from Ms. Gooding?
Yeah, I don't know if these were the numbers that she was giving me before the movement or after. Like these, I'm asking her for the numbers, so I don't know if we can scroll up a bit so I can just get the context of the conversation before that.
Sure.
I see this today. They're using the cameras to try and identify, what trucks are where.
Right. And so you would agree with me that on the 15th, there were trucks still on Metcalf, correct?
Yeah, I actually walked it, and a good portion of Metcalf was cleared.
Right. And there were a number of trucks still on Metcalf, though, correct?
Yep, perhaps south, yes.
And those are all my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Ayotte.
Thank you.
Okay, next, I'd like to call on the convoy organizers.
Good afternoon, sir. For the record, Brendan Miller. I'm counsel to the Freedom Corp, which is an organization representing the protesters that were in your city in January and February of 2022. So just first off, I want to talk to you sort of in your capacity as being the director of safety and that sort of things, or overseeing that department. Can you agree with me that between January 27th and February 14th, there were over 3,000 tickets issued for provincial and municipal infractions?
That sounds correct. I'd have to actually look at the numbers, but we did provide all of those documents through the disclosure process.
Right. And were some of those tickets issued by the bylaw office?
Most of them were issued by the bylaw office.
Right. And I take it that during the issuing of those over 3,000 tickets, none of your bylaw officers were assaulted?
There were some contentious times, and so I can't say that none of them were assaulted. Not that I know of.
Not that you know of, right. So you never had reported to you and no charges were laid against any protester issued a ticket with respect to physically assaulting a bylaw officer?
No, I just know that a couple of them got swarmed, but that they didn't get physically assaulted.
Okay, so 3,000 tickets is a lot. That's a lot of interactions with a lot of protesters. And not a single assaulting a peace officer charge was laid in relation to your bylaw officers.
That's correct.
Now, the numbers I understand is that between January 27th and February 14th, there were a total of 31 arrests made. Is that correct, of the protesters?
You'd have to ask the police that. I don't capture those numbers.
Okay. You don't keep those sort of numbers? You don't capture those sort of numbers?
I don't manage the police. I manage all other emergency services in the city of Ottawa.
Okay. To your knowledge, is it not true, again, you don't have to, if you don't have the information, please just advise. To your knowledge, is it not true that only 16 people of the protesters between that same time period, January 27th and February 14th, were charged?
I can't speak to that.
Thank you. Now, dealing with some of the stuff with respect to the cooperation of the leaders of the protest, as well as dealing with the safety lanes and that sort of thing, is it not true that the protest leaders were actually concerned about maintaining the safety lanes and raised that with you?
They did.
Right. And they wanted to ensure that the lanes were open so that emergency vehicles could always get through?
Correct.
Right. And the protest leaders cooperated with you and the city in maintaining those safety lanes, right?
Yes.
Right. And they maintained them?
For the most part, yes.
Yeah. And when new trucks would even arrive, they even organized to talk with what they refer to as block captains. Did they relay that to you?
No.
All right. But when new vehicles had arrived, to your knowledge, you agree that they always organized to make sure that those safety lanes were open?
Yes.
And you did have, I believe, your fire chief even do an inspection of the Coventry Street or Coventry?
Yeah. Just for clarity, the fire chief wouldn't have done the inspection, but one of his chief officers would have. So there are many different chief levels within the fire service.
Right. And when that fire chief did the inspection, he asked them not to have any open, he did not, or he asked them not to have any open fire pits. Isn't that right?
I can't speak to that. I don't
Okay.
I don't know the contents of that.
Right. I understand that you attended a logistics meeting at City Hall on Sunday evening of February 13th to discuss the truck's moves.
Yeah, that's the only time I ever met with the organizers of the protest.
Is it not true that at that meeting, the protesters explained that two removed camps outside of the city had already been established outside of the city where they would go to?
From my recollection, the discussion was around how are we going to move the trucks out of the residential areas, and that there was limited spots on Wellington Street. So I wasn't 100% sure we could move all 400 trucks onto Wellington. Actually, I knew we couldn't move all 400 trucks onto Wellington Street, and that the agreement, from as far as I was concerned, meant that they had to make sure that those other vehicles left town and left the city of Ottawa. And
Okay.
they said yes, that they had secured ground or
And that's
farmers' properties outside of the city.
Right. So that's what I'm trying to clarify, because I'm just
Yep.
trying to be fair to you, because there's going to be evidence about that. So
Right.
they told you that they had set up two camps in properties they were allowed to be at outside of the city, and that they were looking to move there.
Yeah, they told me that, but I was also aware of that through other intelligence reports
Right.
as well.
And then the plan was that other vehicles would go there, and then there would be some other vehicles that would go to Wellington. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. And the city agreed to that.
Yes.
Right. Now, if the protesters were able to move the vehicles on Tuesday and Wednesday, which is February 15th and 16th, as had been agreed, can you agree that the result would have been most, if not all, of the vehicles would have been cleared out of downtown except for Wellington?
I can't agree with that only because I didn't see a lot of protester vehicles moved except for the ones we allowed onto Wellington. So there seemed to be some movement onto Wellington, but no movement out of the city as was agreed to. So if there would have been a good faith movement on both parts, then I could maybe agree to that, but I can't today.
Right, but isn't it true, and the commission's heard evidence, that the move onto Wellington eventually got blocked?
It got stopped by police, yes.
Right, so it got stopped by the police, so the deal didn't go through because of the police.
Yes.
Right, and so if the deal went through and it was followed, the only vehicles and trucks of the protesters would have been on Wellington.
I am not confident that would have happened.
Right. But there was no reneging on the deal on behalf of the protesters at the time, and that's the evidence the commission's heard today, or to date. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but
Thank you.
But the delta was they didn't control all of the people in that block. They said they wanted to control all of them, and they hoped that they would have all of their buy-in, but they didn't. They had difficulty moving the 40 to Wellington Street because people didn't want to move.
Okay, but the difficulty in moving individuals to Wellington Street after the agreement was announced, I put to you, was only stopped because the police wouldn't let them on to Wellington, and because the police then also stopped them from leaving the streets they were parked on. Isn't that correct?
No, I can't speak to that. You'll have to ask Staff Sergeant Drummond about
Thank you.
that.
Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, it's former Chief Slowly's counsel.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have no questions for Mr. Ayotte.
Okay, next would be the Democracy Fund, JCCF.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ayotte. My name is Rob Kittredge, and I represent the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and we have 5 exciting minutes here together today. So I'm going to plow through a number of questions. Parking tickets serve as a deterrent to illegal parking, don't they?
They do.
When people know that parking illegally will get them a ticket and a fine, that deters at least some people from parking illegally, doesn't it?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to understand a little more about how often Ottawa parking enforcement people can ticket an illegally parked vehicle in the ordinary course of business. So let's say, just to pick a totally random hypothetical example, that I parked my car this morning in the middle of Wellington Street, obstructing traffic, and I left it there for 2.5 weeks. Assuming that for some incomprehensible reason my car didn't get towed, how many parking tickets could I possibly find on my windshield at the end of that period of time?
That's a very good question, and I don't have that answer for you. I don't know the minutiae of the regulations. My background is the fire chief, and now I'm managing all of this, but I don't have that knowledge.
Could a parking ticket be issued daily to an illegally parked vehicle?
I would have to get that information for you.
Would you assume that probably a parking ticket could be issued daily?
I believe it could, because the parking infractions, the signs would say you can't park between a certain time period, and then once that time period lapsed, the next day, the time period would start up again. But
so it'd be reasonable to say that at least 1 ticket per day could be?
That would be reasonable,
Yeah, okay.
yes.
Leaving aside the instruction from OPS to stop bylaw enforcement without police instructions and accompaniment, it's true that illegally parked vehicles weren't ticketed anywhere near that frequently during the process, were they?
I believe I understood the question, but I'm going to kindly ask you to repeat it.
Tickets
And
weren't...
can I just ask you to go a little slower? I'll even give you an extra minute or two.
Deal. All right, I'm trying to plow through
No,
slightly
I know,
more than
but
5 minutes worth of questions. So
But it's with
I
the
get it.
interpreters.
the time is tight. So tickets weren't issued daily to illegally parked trucks during the protests, were they?
That's correct.
If the city had ticketed illegally parked vehicles much more aggressively, don't you think that mounting fines might have persuaded some drivers to move their vehicles?
I do not.
You don't think any drivers would have moved if more tickets were issued?
I do not believe that the protesters were feared getting tickets or fines.
And not a single driver would have moved in the face of mounting ticketing?
I can't say that 100%, but certainly, in my opinion, very few would have left.
All right. You said on the 29th you were instructed by OPS not to ticket in the red zone without their okay and accompaniment. On the 28th, approximately how many bylaw or parking enforcement officers were working in the downtown area?
Yeah, I believe that information is in the disclosed material. I don't have that, but it was in the 10, 15 officers generally work an area, and we would have had that many out that day.
All right. So if those officers were out, they might have needed 10 or 15 police officers accompanying them to do their work in the red zone.
Yes, but on the 28th, that wasn't necessary. Like, it would have been normal practice.
Sure, but going forward, if they
Yes.
needed police accompaniment, that might have meant 15 officers.
It might have. I can't speak to the police operation. They may feel that because of the threat that they would require more than one officer and one bylaw officer to attend those situations.
Sure. I understand that in 2019, the city of Ottawa issued about 350,000 parking tickets. Does that sound about right to you?
That sounds right.
And 250,000 in 2020 due to COVID, I guess, which breaks down to about 20,000 parking tickets per month, or about 10,000 parking tickets every 2 weeks, doesn't it?
You did the math. I'll agree with your math. How's that?
Close-ish, underestimated. But we've heard that only 1,700 parking tickets or so were issued in downtown during that period of time, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
No, sorry, over 3,000 were issued.
Over 3,000. Still,
Yes.
that's quite a bit less than the normal
Yes.
10,000 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ottawa bylaw and parking enforcement officers are trained in dispute resolution and conflict de-escalation, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
And they receive that training because in the ordinary course of business, it's not unusual for ticket recipients to behave in a less than civil manner, isn't it?
Correct.
Right. And on any given day, protest or no protest, it's not unheard of for ticket recipients to get aggressive with enforcement officers, is it?
True.
But no bylaw or parking enforcement officers were attacked or injured by freedom movement protesters, were they?
As I indicated earlier, not that I'm aware of,
Right.
except for the swarming.
And when talking to Commission Council earlier, you discussed the difficulties that the city had obtaining towing services from its standing offer towing contractors and others, and the efforts made to procure towing services. Did the city consider offering increased compensation to towing services to encourage them to provide?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. Did the city consider buying or leasing heavy tow trucks?
We were looking at all options. You still need to train the drivers, and this was still being viewed as a specific time frame, right? By the time we bought a tow truck and we trained an appropriate driver, that would be one truck, and we needed a lot more than one to execute the final plan.
Right. The city never used its two OC Transpo heavy towing rigs during that period of time, did they?
It did not. Initially, they considered it, but they needed it for their daily operations. The bus system was still running, and the buses were still breaking down and required towing. So, and there were also from the union concerns about safety issues.
All right. You mentioned that heavy towing operators were concerned about driver safety, and that was a big reason why services could not be procured. Light towing operators apparently didn't share those concerns, though, since the city's light towing providers continued to tow vehicles in emergency lanes, didn't they?
Correct.
And there were no incidents of assaults, violence, or injuries to towing operators during the protests, were there?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I've gone about 1 minute and 20 seconds over, but those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. Next, it's the Government of Canada.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Mr. Ayotte, my name is Andrew Gibbs, and I'm counsel for the Government of Canada.
Bonjour.
Bonjour. I have about 4 documents and about 5 minutes, so if this seems rushed, it is. The first document I would ask to call up is OTT 301305. And while it's coming up, this is the application record from the City of Ottawa with respect to the injunction on February 13th, 14th. Do you recognize this document?
I do.
And you provided an affidavit in support of this application?
Yes, I did.
And, excuse me, in your affidavit, you detail that the demonstrators were breaching city bylaws, correct?
I did, yes.
And that it was stretching city resources. Is that correct?
Yes.
You also state in the affidavit, I believe it's at paragraph 10, that you'd visited various sites, observed personally, and were advised by operational staff, both bylaw and regulatory services and fire services, to gather the information for the purposes of the affidavit. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you swore this affidavit on February 13th? sorry, if we could maybe go to it. It should be on about page 4, I believe.
I thought it was the 11th, but
Down 2 more pages. And 2 more to the actual affidavit starts. Right here. And it's sworn February 13th, 2022. Do you see that?
yes, I do. Thank you.
And do you adopt the information in this affidavit as true?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Now, at paragraph, excuse me, paragraph 10 of the affidavit, you state that you're monitoring using CCTV cameras, and you were doing this out of concern for public safety and the ability of first responders and other city services to provide emergency and other services to downtown and across the city. Do you see that in paragraph 10?
Yes. Yes.
And so if we turn to, would you, based on the information that's in this affidavit, would you agree that the situation in downtown Ottawa at that time was fluid
Very fluid, yes.
and volatile
Yes.
and unpredictable?
Correct.
If you turn to page 37, please. This is a series of photographs of Exhibit A. Unfortunately, it's on its side. This is one of the photographs taken from the CCTV cameras, is that correct?
Correct.
And in the bottom left-hand corner, it states the location,
Yes, Wellington, Metcalf and Wellington.
Metcalf and Wellington, and the top left-hand corner, the date,
Correct, February 5th.
February 5th, and it's, I believe, 2 p.m.
Correct.
What is the white bar that we see in the middle of the photograph?
That's a boom or it's a crane.
That's a large crane. Is that an industrial crane?
That's an industrial crane, yes.
And are all those trucks in the background, is that the lineup of trucks on Wellington?
That's correct.
And did you know what was in those trucks?
No.
Now, if we go to page 2, I'll just move off of this document, but I would like to go to page 2, where the list of exhibits are included, and I would commend this to the commission, this entire affidavit with the exhibits. There are a series of photographs of fuel depots at Coventry Road, the RCGT Park. You'll see Exhibit D, photographs of fires and fuel stockpiles at Confederation Park. Exhibit E, the bylaw call logs and fire complaints dated February 4th to 12th, 2022. Exhibit F, CCTV images of fireworks on February 5th, 2022. And Exhibit G, and so forth, are the details with respect to call logs. Is that where the various complaints are registered for open fires
Correct.
and parking violations?
Yes.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, I would now like to move to 3 quick documents. If we can bring up OTT 404061. You had mentioned earlier that your officers were directed not to ticket in the red zone. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
And you'd mentioned that that really came into play on February 4th,
No, the 29th of January.
29th of chain? Okay. This email is from February 4th. Roger Chapman, he reports to you,
Yes, he does.
and he states specifically, if you look at the second paragraph, first and foremost, our top priority and responsibility is ensuring the safety of staff. As you have no doubt gathered, this is a potentially volatile situation, and there is a significant difference between ticketing illegally parked vehicles and ticketing a person for a violation, where the latter presents a much greater risk of confrontation. Do you see that?
Yes.
And do you agree with those statements?
Yes, I do.
And in response to the questions you just received from my friend, Mr. Miller, with respect to the lack of tickets or the number of tickets and very little charges laid for assault, would you agree that where the directions to the officers were to ticket vehicles and not people, that is one possible explanation for that discrepancy?
Correct.
Thank you. Skipping right to the bottom, again, officer safety is our first priority, and therefore we will not be enforcing other bylaw violations in the demonstration zone at this time. Demonstration zone, that's the red zone?
Correct.
Thank you. Next document, OTT 406781, please. These are listed as updates. E0CCG update 15 from yourself.
Correct.
Do you recognize this document?
Yes, I do.
And would you agree that the purpose of this document was to provide accurate and timely information to your city colleagues?
Yes, to my city leadership team.
Your city leadership team, thank you. The date of this email is Friday, February 11th, 2022 at 7:53 p.m.
Yes.
And in the third paragraph, we see evidence of external influence persists. The Ottawa Hospital has received some disturbing calls, mostly from the United States, which have been reported to police. PIMR, what does that stand for?
Public Information and Media Relations.
Thank you. Has paused public comments on the City of Ottawa's corporate Facebook and Instagram accounts for the duration of the city's state of emergency due to an apparent coordinated effort to spam the city's feed with hateful or toxic comments, including racist comments or misinformation and rumors. Was that accurate information?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Last, very quickly, document OTT 408754. This is operational update 24 on February 22nd. Can we have that document, please? It's 8740. And it references on the third paragraph. This is again from you. You recognize this?
Yes.
Thank you. CHEO received a false bomb threat yesterday evening. Can you remind the Commissioner what CHEO stands for?
It's the Children's Hospital here in Ottawa.
So the Children's Hospital received a bomb threat. While false calls to 911 have been reduced, there are indications that outside interference persists. Is that correct? There was a bomb threat to the Children's Hospital on February 22nd?
Yes, there was.
Now, Mr. Ayotte, do you have any evidence that that bomb threat was connected to the convoy?
No.
But would you agree that that was part of the challenge in these events?
Correct. We received a tremendous amount of increased 911 calls that were also false during this time, higher than normal amounts of 911 calls. So we suspected that it was related.
And the mayor had testified earlier today to what he referred to as whack-a-mole. Is it not correct and fair to say that you couldn't tell what was coming next?
I think for the most part, yeah, we didn't know where they were going to go. We were trying to be strategic, but it was a difficult time.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, next is the coalition.
We have no questions. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Next is the CCDL and CLA.
Good afternoon, or almost good evening. Mr. Ayotte, my name is Colleen McEwen, and I'm counsel to the Criminal Lawyers Association and the Canadian Council for Criminal Defence Lawyers. These are two organizations comprised of criminal defence lawyers. Many of the questions I have for you have already been canvassed, so I've been trying to tailor them as we've gone along. If I could just pick up on some questioning you got earlier about sort of the number of tickets overall over the course of a year. My friend said perhaps it was 300,000 or 250,000, and you said you didn't have the numbers in front of you, but you know that was sort of about right. Is that right?
Yes.
And he gave you an estimate that could mean something like 20,000 tickets being issued monthly. Is that right?
Yes.
And my understanding, not having seen these figures myself, but this would be for across the whole city.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Correct.
But is it still your view then that the 3,000 tickets that were issued over the course of the demonstration in the demonstration zone or related to the demonstration, that this would be a sort of a smaller fraction of tickets that bylaw services would have had the capacity to issue?
Yes, but there were a lot more infractions in that zone that could have been ticketed.
Right. So there were many more infractions, and this is a smaller number than the tickets that might have been issued, but for the safety concerns you've already described.
Correct.
And I understand that that Bylaw and Regulatory Services received an approval for an increase to the set fines for various bylaw infractions on February 8th. Does that sound right?
Yes.
And I know you've already adopted the contents of the affidavit you swore as part of the city's injunction application in the course of questioning by another council. So I'll just draw your attention that you said in that affidavit that you didn't think that these increased fines had any impact on the ongoing bylaw violations. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that was the affidavit you swore on February 14th. And I take it that your opinion didn't change after you swore the affidavit, that there wasn't some change after that fact.
My opinion hasn't changed, and the affidavit was sworn on February 13th.
Right. And yes, and after February 13th, there wasn't those changes from February 8th. You didn't change your opinion of whether they had an impact.
No, my opinion remains the same.
Okay. Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now to City of Ottawa.
Thank you, Commissioner. Alyssa Tompkins, Counsel for the City of Ottawa. Mr. Ayotte, I just have a few questions today. You had mentioned in your evidence that there was a document that reflected the direction to bylaw or to the EOC through the EOC on January 29th. I'm just going to take you to that for the record.
Yes.
So if we could turn up document OTT 00001270. And if we could just scroll next page, please. Okay. Under number 3, under section updates, there's a comment from a Jay Gravel. Who's Jay Gravel, do you know?
Jay Gravel is one of our commanders in the incident management system. So he used to work for Bylaw Services, and now he works for Roads.
Okay, and it says here, BLRS, we're experiencing issues. A perimeter red zone has been established. If BLRS are required to enter that zone as directed by the NCRCC, they'll be provided police escort. And then we have a comment from Kay Cochran. Can you remind the Commissioner who is Kay Cochran?
Kelly Cochran, she's part of our EOC staff.
And she states, police advising BLRS to withdraw services if they are encountering concerns will provide escorts on an as-needed basis. Is this the direction to which you were referring earlier?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you. There was a couple incidents discussed last week in the evidence involving the Chateau Laurier and the Rideau Center. And I was just hoping you could provide the Commissioner with additional information on that. So starting with the Chateau Laurier, are you familiar with the concern that was raised?
Yes, it was raised directly to me, and we had it investigated.
Can you explain to the Commissioner what happened and what the city's follow-up was?
Certainly. Basically, there was an alarm for a water leak or a sprinkler head that had been knocked off, and so it was an alarm call for the fire service. The fire service responded with 4 different trucks from different directions, from different fire stations, which is normal from a deployment of our resources perspective. We don't respond with just one truck. We respond with multiple, especially for a high-risk setting like a hotel. On arrival, one of the trucks, got close enough but didn't get very close, and that's what was observed by the hotel. And I thought, oh my God, if there's an emergency, they can't get in here. The reality is there was 3 other trucks responding. The responders were already in the hotel dealing with the incident. There was no delay in response. So this was a time where people were very aware of all kinds of different issues, and it was being raised through the BIAs and Hotel Association that these types of concerns needed to be addressed because of public safety, their liability insurance, etc. So while I understand their fear, the risk of this call was very low, and we had pre-planned that facility daily, and we've had conversations with the manager since. So really, from a risk perspective, it was a relatively low-risk event, but it did highlight that, if there was a fire, we may not get all 4 trucks there immediately, and there would be some need for movement of the protest vehicles. So while it was an incident that was looked at, it wasn't deemed as high risk as it was being first explained to us.
Thank you, Mr. Ayotte. And in relation to the Rideau Center incident, it might be helpful if we bring up the email correspondence. If someone could turn up document OTT 408284. So this is an email exchange between you and Councillor Fleury. Do you recall this exchange?
Yes, I do.
And we had seen your response or the draft response prepared last week, but if we could scroll down and you could just explain the response to the Commissioner.
Yes, can you just go up a bit so I can see where that's from Jennifer Turlcleston. Okay, now you can go back down. So in this particular case, it's a private property, so they could request that by law come and remove illegal vehicles. It was a truck, a construction type truck that had a legal diesel container in it. So the fear of it, as Councillor Fleury indicated last week, we should have evacuated the Rideau Center. Well, that's not accurate because the risk was still very low. So in this particular case, the police attended initially, looked at the truck, spoke to the owner, told him he'd have to move it or he'd be getting a ticket. Bylaw eventually went out and gave them a ticket. Rideau Center wanted it removed. It was one of those times when getting a tow for a small vehicle was more difficult, more challenging for us. And as a result of that, it took some time for us to secure the tow vehicle to come and actually remove it from the Rideau Center. And when it finally, when the tow truck was finally en route, the owner moved it himself. So the Rideau Center was frustrated that it took, a day and a half to actually deal with this issue. But again, when we're dealing with the whole protest, we're looking at risk, and we're looking at risk-based responses as well. So yes, there are, the councillor was concerned about the amount of layers with regards to us having to get the police involved and the police coming back and then the police saying they can't escort by law because they don't have the resources. And I could understand that frustration, and I could understand the Rideau Center's frustration. They have valid concerns. From a risk perspective, this was also a very low risk incident.
Thank you, Mr. Ayotte. The last thing I was hoping you could assist the Commissioner with is the movement of trucks subsequent to the mayor's deal. You mentioned during your evidence that you went for a walk and observed the movement. If you could just explain to the Commissioner what you observed on your walk on the various streets. Yeah, so yes, certainly. I went down to Wellington just to see, how much trucks had been moved, and I noticed that they hadn't just been moved, but they've been placed in a row where they can park a lot more of the trucks. And I think that they were doing that to try and get as many of the trucks on Wellington as possible. And so there was still quite a bit of room from, Wellington, from, let's say, Kent Street right down to SGM with regards to, the ability to park more trucks. Metcalfe was cleared for the most part. Again, there may have been a few scragglers here and there, south of Laurier. But Kent was still packed. So when Councillor McKinney was walking down Kent Street, she was right. There was no movement of any trucks on Kent Street. In fact, Kent didn't clear out until the police started their action to actually, with the public order teams, to move out. And then the trucks moved out quite quickly. But yeah, so my walk was to I try and identify, has any progress been made, and is there still room? And are the protesters actually moving out as well, or are they just trying to move everything to Wellington Street? And it was my
my perception, I guess, that I didn't see a lot of trucks leaving town. I just saw a lot trying to get on Wellington Street. And again, I can't speak for Officer Drummond and the reasons for stopping it, but I suspect that it might have something to do with that as well, and the negotiation and the ability of both sides to be able to, the give and take factor. So.
Excellent. Those are my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Ayotte.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ayotte. I just want to make sure I understood what you said about the fire issue with the Chateau Laurier. And you said they dispatched 4 fire trucks.
Yes.
That would be the appropriate number of trucks, or was that more trucks than what the appropriate response is?
That is our deployment for an alarm call.
Okay.
So in this particular case, it was an alarm call, general alarm.
So just so I understand, so when you say it wasn't a high risk, it's because it was a broken fire plug, if you like, or
Yeah, sprinkler.
sprinkler. But if there had been a real fire, that would be a real problem, having not all of the trucks that were dispatched, and presumably there would be more trucks dispatched if it were a real fire.
Correct. How it unfolds is depending on the information that the 911 or that the dispatch center, the Ottawa Fire Dispatch Center, receives. If it's just a general alarm, then we proceed with our staffing for a general alarm, and that's enough to get things started. And then if it is a fire, other rigs would be coming in, and they would continue to come in. So that's a general alarm assignment. If it was a fire, if the information came in that we actually have a fire in one of the rooms, there would have been several more vehicles responding because it's a high risk. We would have had 25 firefighters in total responding. So you're looking at 8 or 9 rigs responding.
And I guess all I'm trying to understand is the inability of some rigs to get there would have been a bigger problem if there had been a real fire. Because I think what I'm trying to understand is whether, when you said it wasn't serious, it's because it wasn't a real fire, but access would have been limited if there had been a real fire.
Of course, yes.
And that would have been a big problem.
And that was the concern of the Chateau Laurier. Okay. But they were portraying it as oh my God, they couldn't get in at all. Well, that was one of the 4 trucks. The other 3.
But you're not saying it wasn't a problem.
No, I'm saying it's a problem. It was a problem everywhere with the congestion. Ideally, there's a reason why we have large roads so that we can get the trucks set.
And the same thing for Kent Street. If there'd been, because we saw, I think yesterday, apartment buildings on Kent Street that were inaccessible because Kent was blocked, that would have been a serious problem if there'd been a serious fire.
No doubt. And we planned for those, but again, we were lucky there were no serious fires.
Okay, I thank you for coming. There's just one more. You may have some re-examination. No, there is no re-examination, so we're done for the day, and we want to thank you for coming and testifying today. And thank you all for ending it a little earlier than I thought, and we are back tomorrow at 9:30.
The commission is adjourned. La commission est adjournée.
Oui.